Gia stood at the edge of the training ring, her body covered in a thin layer of sweat. She had been practicing for 6 hours straight. The gym was almost empty now. Only her coach, Mr. Park, remained. Again, Mr. Park said, his voice firm but kind. Gia nodded. She moved to the center of the ring and closed her eyes. She took 3 deep breaths. Then her eyes snapped open. Her body moved in a blur of motion. Punches, kicks, and spins flowed together like water. Each move was perfect. Mr. Park watched with pride. 5 years ago, Gia was just another human fighter trying to make her mark in the Galactic Combat Federation. Now, she was the champion. Enough for today, Mr. Park finally said. You need rest before tomorrow's fight. Gia grabbed her towel and wiped her face. The Dralaxian fighter. What do we know about him? 3 arms, tough skin, and a bad temper. Mr. Park handed her a water bottle. But slow. All Dralaxians are slow. Gia drank deeply. She had beaten 12 alien fighters in the past year alone. Each one was stronger than her. Each one had natural weapons she did not have. Some had claws. Others had tough skin that could stop punches. A few could even see in directions humans could not. But Gia kept winning. The news feeds are calling this the biggest mismatch yet, Mr. Park said, showing her his tablet. On the screen, a tall purple alien with 3 muscular arms flexed for the camera. The headline read, Human Chihe Ampions Stuariki to end. Dior Warrior Pro Mizias Quikiki Vicitiori. Gia smiled. They always say that. Outside the gym, a small crowd of fans waited. When Gia stepped out, they cheered. Most were human, but she spotted a few aliens too. A young Centauri, with its blue skin and large eyes, pushed forward. Ms. Gia, can I have your mark? It asked in broken human language, holding out a pen and paper. Gia signed her name and smiled at the alien child. 5 years ago, most aliens thought humans were weak. Now, because of fighters like Gia, they saw humans differently. In her apartment that night, Gia watched videos of her next opponent. The Dralaxian was strong, yes. His 3 arms gave him an advantage in close fighting. But Gia saw something in the way he moved. A pattern. A weakness. Her phone rang. It was Sun, her sister. Are you ready for tomorrow? Sun asked. Yes, Gia said. Another day, another fight. The whole family will be watching. Even Grandma has a betting slip on you. Gia laughed. Tell Grandma not to spend her winnings before I actually win. After the call, Gia stood on her balcony and looked at the night sky. Stars filled the darkness. Each one possibly had planets with their own civilizations and fighters. Before humans joined the galactic community, everyone thought Earth was just another backwater world with nothing special to offer. Then humans started competing in galactic sports. They didn't have the strength of a Dralaxian or the speed of a Centauri. But humans had something else. Adaptability. The ability to study, learn, and overcome. While other species relied on their natural gifts, humans trained and planned. Gia was the perfect example. At first glance, she didn't look impressive. Average height, normal human muscles. No claws, no armor-like skin, no extra limbs. But in the ring, she became something else. She studied each opponent and found their weakness. Tomorrow would be no different. The Dralaxian would come in confident, believing his strength would crush her. And tomorrow, like all the others before him, he would learn why humans had earned their place among the stars. Gia took one last look at the night sky, then went inside to sleep. The champion needed her rest. The galaxy was watching. The big day arrived. The Seoul Galactic Arena was packed with 20,000 people. Humans sat next to aliens from 100 different worlds. The noise was deafening. Gia sat in her private room, wrapping her hands with fighting tape. Mr. Park stood nearby, checking her gear. The Dralaxian has been talking all morning. Mr. Park said. He says humans are too fragile, that you will break like a twig. Jia smiled. Let him talk. A knock on the door interrupted them. A tall man in a fancy suit entered. This was Mr. Lee, the head of the Earth Fighting Committee. Jia, we have a situation, Mr. Lee said. His face was serious. The Galactic Council has sent a special request. Jia stopped wrapping her hands. What kind of request? There's a diplomatic summit on Earth next week. Many important aliens will attend. They want you to fight in a special exhibition match. Against who? Jia asked. Mr. Lee handed her a tablet. On the screen was a picture of a massive creature with thick, gray skin that looked like armor. It had 4 arms and a head with no neck. Its yellow eyes seemed to glow. Krell, the Arcturian champion, Mr. Lee said. He has never lost a fight. Mr. Park grabbed the tablet. Impossible. Arcturians are twice as strong as Tralaxians. Their skin can stop bullets. The Council feels this match would show the strength of human spirit, Mr. Lee explained. It would bring honor to Earth. Jia studied the picture. The Arcturian looked unbeatable, but that's what they said about all her opponents. When? She asked. Next Friday. The main event of the summit, Mr. Lee replied. Will you accept? Jia nodded. Yes. Mr. Lee seemed relieved. Thank you. The whole planet will be proud. He left quickly, probably to tell the Council the good news. Mr. Park shook his head. This is too dangerous, Jia. Arcturians are not like other aliens. Every fighter has a weakness, Jia said. I just need to find Krell's. Another knock came at the door. This time, it was a young staff member. 5 minutes until your fight, Ms. Jia, he said nervously. Jia finished wrapping her hands and stood up. She rolled her shoulders and bounced on her toes. She was ready. In another part of the arena, a young Korean man named Han sat alone. He watched a small screen showing Jia preparing for her fight. Han was thin, with glasses and messy hair. He looked more like a student than a fighter. Han touched his tablet, and Jia's image froze. He zoomed in on her stance, studying the way she held her body. He had watched every one of her fights, hundreds of times each. You're amazing, Jia, Han whispered. But I can see what no one else does. Han was a physicist who specialized in body movements. He had spent 2 years creating a computer model of Jia's fighting style. The model showed something interesting, a small flaw that no alien fighter had found. Han's phone beeped. It was a message confirming his application to the amateur showcase before next week's exhibition match. He had applied on a whim, never expecting to be accepted. But the message said, application approved. Report for preliminary assessment tomorrow, 9:00 a.m. Han stared at the message in shock. He had only wanted to test his theory. Now he might actually get to fight. On the screen, Jia walked toward the arena entrance. The crowd roared as spotlights found her. The announcer's voice boomed. And now, the pride of Earth, the undefeated human champion, Jia. Han watched as Jia raised her fist to the crowd. She looked confident, unstoppable. 1 week, Han said to himself. 1 week to perfect my technique. He closed his eyes and imagined standing across from Jia in the ring. Would his theory work in real life, or was he just a dreamer who thought too much? Han didn't know. But soon, the whole galaxy would find out. Han's small apartment was filled with papers and computer screens. On every wall were pictures of Jia fighting. Some showed her punching. Others showed her kicking or dodging. Han had studied each move hundreds of times. It was 3:00 a.m., but Han was still awake. Tomorrow was his assessment for the amateur showcase. He needed to be ready. Han stood in the middle of his living room. He closed his eyes and moved his hand slowly through the air. He was practicing the one move he had created. A simple touch, but at exactly the right spot, with exactly the right pressure. His phone rang. It was his friend Ta, who worked at the university with him. Are you still awake? Tai asked. Yes, Han said. I'm practicing. Ta laughed. You're crazy. You know that, right? You're a physicist, not a fighter. My calculations are correct, Han said. The human body has balance points. If you know where they are, you can control any movement. Theory and practice are different things, Ta said. Jia has been fighting for years. You've been sitting in a lab. Han knew his friend was right, but he also knew his science was sound. The question was, could he actually do it when the time came? Get some sleep, Ta said before hanging up. Don't embarrass yourself tomorrow. Han tried to sleep, but his mind kept working. He thought about how he had discovered Jia's weakness. 2 years ago, he had been watching her fight against a Zentari champion. Everyone cheered when Jia won, but Han saw something odd. For a split second during her famous spin kick, Jia was completely off balance. None of her opponents had ever noticed this tiny window of vulnerability. Han had spent months creating a computer model of Jia's movements. The model showed that a precise touch at the right moment would disrupt her inner ear function. It would be like turning off her balance system for a few critical seconds. In the morning, Han arrived at the Seoul Galactic Arena for his assessment. The waiting room was filled with amateur fighters. Most were strong young men with muscles and tattoos. They stared at Han, this skinny guy with glasses who looked like he had wandered into the wrong building. A large man in a tracksuit approached Han. You're in the wrong place, friend. The science convention is next door. The other fighters laughed. Han said nothing. He just waited for his turn. An official called names, one by one. Each fighter went through a door for their assessment. Some came back looking happy. Others looked disappointed. Finally, the official called Han. Han walked through the door. Inside was a small training ring. 3 judges sat at a table, looking bored. Show us your fighting style, one judge said. Han stepped into the ring. I don't have a style in the traditional sense. The judges frowned. One of them, an older woman, checked her tablet. It says here you're a physicist. Why are you applying for a fighting showcase? I have developed a technique based on biomechanical principles, Han explained. It targets the body's natural balance points. Show us, another judge said. A training dummy was brought into the ring. Han stood very still, focusing. Then he moved forward and touched the dummy at a specific point. Nothing seemed to happen. The judges looked at each other. The older woman sighed. Is that it? In a real fight, against a real person, this would disrupt their balance center, Han said. It works by using their own momentum against them. Theory doesn't win fights, the third judge said. We need someone who can entertain the crowd. Han knew he was failing. They were going to reject him. Then the door opened, and Mr. Lee, the head of the Earth Fighting Committee, walked in. We need diversity in the showcase, Mr. Lee said. Scientists, artists, different types of people, not just fighters. He looked at Han. You're in. Last spot in the amateur showcase. The judges seemed surprised, but they didn't argue. Han couldn't believe it. He had a chance to test his theory, a chance to face Jia. As Han left the assessment room, he passed a screen showing Jia defeating the Dralaxian fighter. The crowd was going wild. 1 week, Han whispered to himself. 1 week until I change everything. The day of the exhibition arrived. The Seoul Galactic Arena was bigger than Han had ever seen it. Special seats had been added for important alien visitors. Flags from 100 worlds hung from the ceiling. Han sat in the preparation area, watching other amateur fighters warm up. They punched the air and stretched their muscles. Some wore fancy gear with team logos. Han wore plain black pants and a white t-shirt. His only equipment was his glasses, which he needed to see clearly. 5 minutes until the amateur showcase begins, an official announced. Han's heart beat faster. He was last on the program. 8 other fights would happen before his turn. He tried to stay calm by reviewing his calculations in his head. In another part of the arena, Jia was meeting with Mr. Park and Mr. Lee. They were discussing her upcoming fight with Krell. the Arcturian champion. He arrived this morning, Mr. Lee said, showing her a video on his tablet. He's even bigger in person. The video showed Krell walking through the spaceport. The Arcturian was massive, with gray skin like stone, and 4 powerful arms. People moved out of his way quickly. His weakness? Jia asked. Mr. Park shook his head. Hard to say. Arcturians don't have many weak points. Their skin is almost like armor. Everyone has a weakness, Jia said. I'll find his. Back in the main arena, the amateur showcase had begun. The crowd was small. Most people would come later for the main event, Jia versus Krell. The seats were only about 1/4 full. The first few fights were quick. Young fighters trying to impress the scouts from professional teams. They punched and kicked with more energy than skill. Hand-washed carefully, learning from their mistakes. The 6th fight ended with a knockout. Medical staff carried the loser away on a stretcher. You're next after this fight, an official told Han. Get ready. Han nodded. He closed his eyes and took deep breaths. The 7th fight was ending when a commotion broke out near the official's table. Han opened his eyes to see people arguing. He moved closer to hear. We're running behind schedule, one official said. The diplomatic delegation arrives in 1 hour. We need to start preparing for the main event. What about the last amateur fight? Another asked. Cancel it. No one's here to see amateurs anyway. Han felt his heart sink. After all his work, he wouldn't get his chance. He stepped forward. Please, he said. I've been preparing for months. The officials looked at him with annoyed faces. Sorry, kid. Time's up, one said. Just then, Jia walked into the area. Everyone straightened up and became more respectful. What's the problem? She asked. We're running late, an official explained. We need to cancel the last amateur fight to prepare for your match with Krell. Jia looked at Han. Their eyes met for the first time. Han felt strange. This was the woman he had studied for years, whose every move he knew better than his own. Who were you supposed to fight? Jia asked Han. Kim Jin, Han said, but he injured his wrist yesterday. They haven't found a replacement. Jia thought for a moment. Then she smiled. I'll fight him, she said. Everyone stared at her in shock. But your match with Krell, Mr. Park began. We'll be fine, Jia said. I need a warm-up anyway. A quick exhibition match with. She looked at Han. What's your name? Han, he said, his voice suddenly dry. A quick match with Han, Jia continued. 5 minutes, no more, just to entertain the early crowd. The officials looked at each other. No one wanted to argue with the champion. Fine, the head official said. 5 minutes only. No scoring, just a demonstration. Han couldn't believe what was happening. He was going to fight Jia. Right now. His heart pounded in his chest. Thank you, he said to Jia. She smiled. Don't thank me yet. I'll try to go easy on you. As they prepared to enter the arena, Han closed his eyes one last time. All his research, all his calculations, it was time to see if science could defeat experience. The announcer's voice boomed through the arena. Ladies and gentlemen, humans and honored galactic visitors, we have a special treat for you. The crowd, which had been small, was growing. Word spread quickly that Jia would fight before her main event. Earth's champion, Jia, will now perform a demonstration match with amateur contestant Han. Han walked into the arena. The lights were bright. The noise was loud. His hands shook slightly. He had never been in front of so many people before. Jia entered from the other side. The crowd cheered wildly. She smiled and waved. She wore her famous fighting suit, black with red trim. Han noticed she moved with perfect balance, her feet never crossing. They met in the center of the ring. Jia was shorter than Han expected. In person, she looked like a normal young woman, not the superhuman fighter from the videos. I've never seen you before, Jia said. Are you new? Yes, Han replied. This is my first time. He didn't tell her about the 2 years he had spent studying her moves. Just relax and have fun, Gia said kindly. I'll make you look good. The referee, a tall man with a shiny bald head, gave them instructions. This is a demonstration only. 5 minutes, no official scoring. Gia nodded. Han tried to look calm, but his heart was racing. In the front row, Mr. Park watched with concern. This is a waste of time, he said to Mr. Lee. She should be focusing on Krell. Let her warm up, Mr. Lee replied. The amateur looks harmless. The bell rang. The match began. Gia moved forward with smooth steps. She threw a light punch that Han easily dodged. She smiled, impressed by his quick movement. Good reflexes, she said. The crowd watched with mild interest. Some were still finding their seats. Others checked the time, waiting for the real event to begin. In the special section for alien dignitaries, a group of Arcturians watched. Among them was Krell, studying his future opponent. The human female is skilled, one Arcturian said to Krell. Are you concerned? Krell made a rumbling sound that might have been laughter. Humans are fragile. Their bones break easily. Back in the ring, Gia increased her speed. She threw faster punches and kicks, testing Han's defenses. Han blocked some and dodged others. He was not trying to attack. He was waiting for the right moment. Gia noticed his unusual style. You're not fighting back, she said. I'm waiting, Han replied. Gia raised an eyebrow. Then she smiled. Waiting for what? Instead of answering, Han moved slightly to his left. This subtle movement forced Gia to adjust her stance. In the front row, Mr. Park leaned forward. Something was strange about this amateur fighter. He wasn't moving like a beginner. Who is this guy? Mr. Park asked. Mr. Lee checked his tablet. Han, age 26, physicist at Seoul National University, specializes in biomechanics. A scientist. Mr. Park frowned. What's he doing in the ring? In the ring, Gia decided to end the demonstration. The crowd was getting restless. They wanted to see some action. Let's give them a show, she said to Han. I'll come at you with my spin kick. Just try to block it. Don't worry. I won't hit you hard. Han nodded. This was the moment he had prepared for. Gia stepped back. The crowd recognized her stance. They knew what was coming. Her famous spin kick had defeated champions from 17 different worlds. Here we go, she said. Gia began to spin. Her body turned with perfect form. Her leg extended for the kick, the move that had made her famous throughout the galaxy. Han didn't try to block or dodge. Instead, he stepped forward at precisely the right angle. His hand moved toward a specific point on Jia's leg. In the front row, Mr. Park jumped to his feet. What is he doing? Time seemed to slow down. Han's fingers made contact with Jia's leg at exactly the point his calculations had predicted. He applied gentle pressure and redirected her momentum. It was a simple touch. It looked like nothing. But Han knew the science behind it was perfect. The crowd held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. What happened next seemed impossible to everyone watching. Jia's body, which had been spinning with perfect control, suddenly went off balance. Her kick, which should have stopped just before hitting Han, went wild. She spun too far, her leg moving in the wrong direction. Her eyes widened in surprise. And then, the champion fell. Jia crashed to the mat with a loud thud. She tried to stand up immediately, but her legs wouldn't work right. She felt like the room was spinning. When she tried to push herself up, she fell again. The arena went completely silent. 10,000 people and aliens stared in shock. No one had ever seen Jia fall before. Han stood still, surprised that his theory had worked so perfectly. He had expected some effect, but not this complete disruption of her balance. The referee looked confused. This was supposed to be a friendly demonstration, not a real fight. But the champion was on the ground, unable to stand. What happened? Someone in the crowd shouted. Mr. Park jumped into the ring and ran to Jia. Are you okay? Are you hurt? Jia shook her head, still dizzy. I don't know what happened. My balance is wrong. The referee started counting, following the rules of the sport. 1, 2, 3. In the special section, Krill and the other Arcturians watched with great interest. How did the human male do that? One asked. He barely touched her. 4, 5, 6. The referee continued. Mr. Lee also entered the ring. He looked at Han with suspicion. What did you do to her? I applied pressure to a specific nerve point that temporarily affects the inner ear, Han explained. It disrupts balance for about 30 seconds. She'll be fine. 7, 8. Jia tried once more to stand, but the room was still spinning. She had never felt anything like this before. 9, 10. The referee raised his hand and pointed to Han. Winner by knockout. The crowd exploded with noise. Some cheered. Others booed. Most just talked loudly, trying to understand what they had seen. This wasn't supposed to be a real match. Mr. Park shouted at the referee. She couldn't stand up within the count of 10. The referee said, rules are rules. The big screens around the arena showed the replay of what had happened. In slow motion, everyone could see Han's hand make contact with a specific point on Jia's leg. It looked like nothing, just a simple touch. But the result was the champion crashing to the mat. Han walked over to Jia and offered his hand. Are you feeling better? The effect should be wearing off now. Jia blinked several times. The spinning was slowing down. She took Han's hand and stood up carefully. What did you do? She asked. She wasn't angry, just curious. It's a pressure point technique based on biomechanics, Han said. I've been studying your movements for 2 years. Jia looked at him with new respect. 2 years? Just to learn how to beat me. Han nodded. Your spin kick has a moment of vulnerability. No one ever noticed it before because they were too focused on blocking the kick itself. The crowd was still making noise. Officials were arguing with each other. Mr. Lee was on his phone, probably talking to the Galactic Council about what this meant for the main event. But in the center of the ring, Jia and Han were having their own quiet conversation. Show me, Jia said. What? Show me how you did it. The pressure point. Han hesitated, then nodded. He slowly demonstrated the movement, explaining the science behind it. Jia listened carefully. Then she smiled. Impressive. I've fought champions from 17 worlds, and none of them ever found that weakness. Because they were looking for weakness in the wrong place, Han said. They tried to match your strength. But humans don't win with strength. What do we win with? Jia asked. Knowledge, Han replied. Understanding. Seeing what others miss. Jia nodded. She understood. In that moment, something important changed between them. They were no longer just opponents. They were two humans who had both found different ways to compete in a galaxy of stronger beings. Around them, the chaos continued. No one knew what would happen next. The officials moved Jia and Han to a private room away from the noise of the crowd. Mr. Park and Mr. Lee came with them. Everyone was talking at once. The main event starts in 40 minutes, Mr. Lee said, checking his watch. Jia, can you still fight Krell? I feel fine now, Jia said. The dizziness was gone. But I need to understand what happened first. All eyes turned to Han. The young physicist looked uncomfortable with the attention. Explain again, Mr. Park said. What exactly did you do? Han took a deep breath. Every fighter has patterns. Jia's spin kick is perfect, except for one tiny moment. There's a point when her balance depends on the position of her leg. I found a nerve cluster here. He pointed to a spot on his own leg. If you touch it during that exact moment, it sends confusing signals to the inner ear. That's why I couldn't stand, Jia said, understanding now. My brain thought I was still spinning even after I stopped. Han nodded. It only works during the spin kick, and only for a few seconds. Mr. Park looked impressed despite himself. You figured this out just by watching videos and running computer simulations, Han said. Thousands of them. Outside the room, they could hear the crowd still buzzing with excitement. News of Jia's defeat was spreading fast. Reporters were demanding interviews. Mr. Li's phone rang. He answered it and listened for a moment. His face became serious. The Arcturian delegation wants to meet with both of you, he said after hanging up. Now, Jia and Han looked at each other in surprise. Both of us? Han asked. Why me? I don't know, Mr. Li said, but we can't refuse. They were led to a special meeting room. Inside, Krell sat with 3 other Arcturians. They were huge compared to the humans, with their stone-like gray skin and 4 powerful arms. Their yellow eyes watched as the humans entered. Sit, one Arcturian said. His voice was deep and rough. Jia and Han sat across from them. Mr. Li and Mr. Park stood behind. Krell spoke directly to Han. You defeated the human champion with 1 move. Han swallowed nervously. It was a demonstration match, not official. It was still a defeat, Krell said. He turned to Jia. You will not fight me today. Mr. Li stepped forward. The match has been announced. The Galactic Council expects. I will not fight her, Krell interrupted. I want to fight him. He pointed one massive finger at Han. Everyone stared at Krell in shock. That's impossible, Mr. Park said. Han is not a professional fighter. He's a scientist who defeated your champion, another Arcturian said. We find this interesting. Han shook his head. My technique only works on Jia's specific movement. It won't work on an Arcturian. Krell made a sound like stones grinding together. It might have been laughter. You misunderstand. We do not fear your technique. We want to understand it. The Council sent me to evaluate human fighting methods. This new approach is worth studying. Jia suddenly understood. You're not here just to fight. You're here to learn about us. The lead Arcturian nodded. Humans are physically weak compared to most species. Yet you continue to win. This is unusual in the galaxy. We adapt, Jia said. We find ways to overcome stronger opponents. Yes, the Arcturian agreed. And now we see a new adaptation. A fighter who uses science instead of strength. He looked at Han. We want to see more. Han felt trapped. He wasn't a real fighter. His one technique had worked on Jia. But it wouldn't help against an Arcturian with completely different biology. Jia saw Han's panic. She made a quick decision. We will both fight Krell, she said. Together. Everyone looked at her in surprise. 2 against 1. Mr. Li asked, Is that allowed? The Arcturians discussed among themselves in their own language. Finally, Krell nodded. Acceptable, he said. 2 humans against 1 Arcturian. The match will proceed in 30 minutes. As they left the meeting room, Han grabbed Jia's arm. What are you doing? He whispered. I can't fight an Arcturian. Jia smiled. You won't have to. Just follow my lead. I have an idea. Back in the preparation room, Jia and Han had 20 minutes before their fight with Krell. Mr. Park paced back and forth, worried. This is crazy, he said. Han has no training. And Krell could break both of you with 1 arm. We're not going to beat him with strength, Jia said. She turned to Han. We need to combine our approaches. Your science and my experience. Han nodded, but he looked pale. I've never been in a real fight before. My technique only worked on you because I study your movements for years. Then we need to find something about Arcturians that you can use, Jia said. She pulled out her tablet and showed Han videos of Arcturians fighting. Han watched carefully. Their center of gravity is different from ours, he noted. They have 4 arms but only 2 legs. That creates an interesting balance point. As they studied the videos, Mr. Li entered the room. "The arena is full," he said. "Every seat sold out. News of what happened has spread across the planet. Even the galactic news networks are covering it." "No pressure," Han mumbled. Jia put her hand on his shoulder. "Focus on the problem. Ignore everything else." Han took a deep breath and continued watching the videos. Then he saw something. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the screen. "When Arcturians throw a punch with their upper arms, they shift their weight forward slightly." Jia leaned closer. "You're right. I never noticed that before. It's subtle, but it creates a brief moment of vulnerability," Han explained. "If we could somehow make Krell punch with both upper arms at the same time, he'd be off balance for a split second." Jia finished. "But how do we use that?" Han thought for a moment. "I need to calculate the exact force and angle required." He began writing equations on a piece of paper. Jia watched him work, amazed at how his mind operated. "You see fighting differently than I do," she said. Han looked up. "You see it as art. I see it as physics. Together, maybe we see it completely," Jia said. The door opened, and an official stuck his head in. 5 minutes. Han finished his calculations. "I think I have it, but we'll need perfect timing." "Tell me the plan," Jia said. Han explained quickly. Jia listened and nodded. It was risky, but it might work. As they walked toward the arena, Han felt his legs shaking. "I'm scared," he admitted. "Good," Jia said. "Fear keeps you sharp." The noise from the crowd grew louder as they approached the entrance to the arena. Thousands of voices merged into one roaring sound. "Remember," Jia said, "when I give the signal, be exactly 3 steps to my left." Han nodded. 3 steps. I'll be there." The announcer's voice boomed over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, humans and honored galactic visitors, the main event has changed. Earth champion Jia and scientist Han will face the Arcturian champion Krell in a special exhibition match." The crowd roared as Jia and Han entered the arena together. The lights were blinding. The noise was deafening. Han felt like he might pass out. Krell entered from the opposite side. He was even more intimidating in person. His gray skin looked like it could stop bullets. His 4 arms moved with surprising grace for such a large being. His yellow eyes fixed on the 2 humans with clear confidence. They met in the center of the ring. Krell towered over them. The referee gave instructions, but Han could barely hear them over the pounding of his heart. "Remember your science," Jia whispered to Han. "Remember your experience," Han whispered back. The bell rang. The match began. Krell moved forward with surprising speed. His lower right arm swung at Jia, who ducked under it. His upper left arm reached for Han, who barely stepped away in time. "He's faster than he looks," Jia called to Han. "Stick to the plan," Han replied. Jia began moving in a circle, forcing Krell to turn to follow her. Han moved in the opposite direction. The Arcturian couldn't watch both of them at once. In the front row, Mr. Park watched nervously. "What are they doing?" he asked Mr. Lee. "I think they're trying to confuse him," Mr. Lee replied. Krell grew frustrated with the human's movement. He lunged at Jia, who rolled away from his grasp. This put Han directly behind the Arcturian. "Now," Jia shouted. Han counted. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps to Jia's left. He was in position. It was time to see if science and skill together could defeat the most powerful fighter in the galaxy. Jia ran straight at Krell. This was not part of their plan, and Han almost called out to stop her. But then he understood. She was setting up their trap. Krell saw the small human female charging at him. All 4 of his arms prepared to grab her. This was exactly what he wanted. Just before reaching Krell, Jia dropped to the ground and slid between his legs. The Arcturian turned in confusion. Now Jia was behind him, and Han was in front. "Both sides," Jia shouted. They attacked at the same time. Jia from behind, Han from the front. Krell had to defend in two directions at once. He swung his lower arms at Jia, while his upper arms moved to block Han. This was the moment they had planned for. With all four arms in motion, Krell's balance shifted exactly as Han had calculated. "Now," Han shouted. Jia dodged Krell's lower arms and struck a specific point on his back, the spot Han had identified from the videos. At the same moment, Han dropped to one knee and pushed against Krell's left knee with precise pressure. The huge Arcturian wobbled. His yellow eyes widened in surprise. His forearms waved as he tried to regain his balance. "Together," Jia called. She and Han moved in perfect sync. They each grabbed one of Krell's arms and pulled in opposite directions, using his own momentum against him. The crowd gasped as the mighty Arcturian champion toppled over. He fell to the mat with a crash that shook the entire arena. The sound was like a tree falling in a forest. For a moment, no one moved. Krell lay on his back, all four arms spread out. He looked as surprised as everyone else. The referee started counting. 1, 2, 3. In the special section, the Arcturian delegation leaned forward. No one had ever seen Krell fall before. 4, 5, 6. Krell tried to roll over to get up, but Han had calculated this too. The way Arcturians were built made it hard for them to rise quickly from a flat position on their backs. 7, 8. The crowd began to cheer. Humans stood up, shouting encouragement to Jia and Han. 9. Krell finally managed to roll to his side, but it was too late. 10. The referee raised his hand. Winners by knockout, Jia and Han of Earth. The arena exploded with noise. Humans hugged each other. Some cried with joy. Even aliens in the crowd seemed impressed by what they had witnessed. Jia and Han looked at each other in disbelief. Then they smiled and clasped hands. The scientist and the fighter had done what seemed impossible. Krell finally got to his feet. He towered over the humans. For a tense moment, everyone wondered what he would do. Would he be angry? Would he demand a rematch? To everyone's surprise, Krell extended all four of his arms, 2 to Jia and 2 to Han. "Well fought," the Arcturian said. His voice was deep but respectful. "You used your minds instead of matching my strength. This is impressive." Jia and Han shook his hands. The crowd cheered even louder. In the front row, Mr. Park wiped tears from his eyes. "Did you see that?" he asked Mr. Lee. "They did it. They actually did it." Mr. Lee nodded. "This changes everything. The whole galaxy just saw what humans can do." Later, in the press room, reporters from Earth and other worlds crowded around Jia and Han. "How did you defeat an Arcturian champion?" one asked. Jia smiled. "The same way humans have always survived in a dangerous universe. We adapted. We observed. We worked together." Han nodded. "Krell was stronger, but we found a way to use that strength against him." "Will you two fight together again?" another reporter asked. Jia and Han looked at each other. In just one day, they had gone from strangers to partners. "I think we have a lot to learn from each other," Jia said. "Science and skill," Han added. "Knowledge and experience." As they left the arena that night, crowds of humans cheered them. Children asked for autographs. Aliens watched with new respect in their eyes. Han looked up at the night sky. The same stars he had seen all his life now seemed different. "Do you think this will change things?" he asked Jia. "It already has," she replied. "Today, we showed the galaxy that humans don't need to be the strongest to win. We just need to be the smartest." They walked side by side into the future they had created together.